Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today we're going to be talking about takeaways from the 2017 Proxy season. And joining us to discuss that will be Paul DeNicola, who's the Managing Director for PwC's Governance Insights Center. Welcome, Paul. I should say welcome back.
Good to be here, TK.
And joining him is Leah Malone, who's the director also with the center. Leah, welcome.
Hi, nice to see you.
So, okay, Paul, we're going to start with you. And Proxy season just ended, sort of ends in June. We've got people that have different dates, but for all practical purposes, most of their seasons end in June. And we want to take a look at that shareholder voting. And I know you guys always look at that, and we'll talk about that part of it in a minute. But what are the main takeaways? What came out of the season that everybody should be aware of?
Yeah, so TK, I think there are two or three real big takeaways from the 2017 season. I mean, in my mind, the biggest headline is the real change in policies, in engagement, and in voting on the part of mainstream institutional investors on ESG, environmental, social, and governance shareholder proposals. So if you step back and take a look at all of the shareholder proposals that came in 2017, about 40% of those proposals were ESG related. So that's goes back to 2014 in terms of setting a record, largest in the category. So lots of ESG proposals. And I think some of that can be attributed to the U.S. Pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, the perception that the federal government may be less engaged in environmental initiatives and that it's the private sector that's going to be picking this up, even through the shareholder proposal process. But if you look at the big environmental proposals that came out in 2017, three key areas. One, the biggest one was climate change proposals, where you had 69 shareholder proposals averaging an unprecedented support at 34%. You also had a number of shareholder proposals on environmental impacts on communities and supply chains, and also requests for sustainability reports. So those were the ESG proposals that got a lot of movement. With regard to the climate change proposals, for the first time we saw three climate change proposals get majority shareholder support. And these climate change proposals were asking for a report on the impact of climate change policies, but also to analyze the impacts of commitments to limit global temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius. So very specific in terms of what they were looking for. The question becomes why? Why this year? Well, there was a shift. You saw it in the approach of large investors like Vanguard, Fidelity, BlackRock, in terms of supporting these proposals, which we didn't see prior. So they have come around to really see financial risk and opportunity in ESG, and have changed their policies and voting practices around it. So ESG is the big takeaway from 2017. The other is the big debate around virtual-only annual meetings. So, if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, you only have a handful of companies that did fully virtual meetings, where your shareholder meeting is completely electronic via audio or video, with no live meeting with directors and management. This year you had a few hundred companies actually do it. So increasing number of these, but increasing pushback on the part of investors. So you had the New York City Comptroller and CalPERS and CII vigorously advocate for or against these virtual annual meetings, because the idea is that it disenfranchises shareholders. So that was a big trend. The SEC issued an important no action letter for companies when HP received the shareholder proposals, so that companies now have this no action letter as precedent for next proxy season if these proposals come up. But investors have been so vocal about their opposition to virtual only meetings. And by the way, they've been supportive of hybrid meetings, which are both virtual and live. They simply don't want the virtual only. That I think a lot of companies are going to give second thought to making the move, and that's a question we've been getting from a lot of clients. So ESG and virtual meetings, and the other final thing to look out for coming is whether or not there are going to be changes in the thresholds for submitting shareholder proposals next year. So we're keeping our eye on that.
Well, I can tell you this, 5 years ago, if we would have done an event on ESG, nobody attends. Okay, it was unbelievable, the lack of sensitivity, and to see what's happened in 12 months with the interest in ESG has been sort of amazing.
Yep, absolutely.
So Leah, there's one thing, one giant elephant in the room that we haven't talked about relative to proxy voting, and that's executive compensation.
Executive compensation.
So tell our audience what, we can't talk about proxy voting without talking about executive compensation.
Yeah, and you know, the big story with executive compensation every year is say on pay. So the takeaways this year is say on pay. Every year we've seen it kind of tick up, support a little bit higher, a little bit higher. It's always in the 90s. This year it looks like support was even higher than ever. Only 27 companies in the Russell 3000 failed their say on pay votes this year. It's a record low. Only 2 S&P 500 companies failed their say on pay votes. So I think what we've seen is this is kind of the story of shareholder engagement with companies. We've been living with say on pay for 6 years. Over that period of time, we've seen a lot more shareholder engagement, especially on executive compensation issues. Shareholders are getting used to talking directly to management, to boards of directors about what is your company doing with its compensation plans, how are they working, how are they not, how are they incentivizing the right behaviors. Directors are making the case about how their pay plans really incentivize performance that's good for shareholders, good for the company. So we've seen shareholders really getting quite comfortable with the types of plans that companies have in place. We also saw this year say on pay frequency votes. This is the second time these votes have come up. The Dodd-Frank Act required that companies go out to shareholders at least once every 6 years and ask them, how often should we be doing say on pay votes? When this first happened in 2011, most shareholders supported annual say on pay votes. This year, the support for annual votes is even higher. Shareholders really like having that touch point every year with the company. The ability to say, yeah, we think you're doing a good job on executive compensation overall, or saying, look, we see real problems here. Proxy advisors are also playing a role here. The fact that they can kind of threaten to vote against or to recommend votes against a company's say on pay if they see problematic pay practices at that company has really, I think, changed the executive compensation landscape a little bit. We're seeing those problematic pay practices really fall away with the threat of that say on pay recommendation against. The other big stories are kind of regulatory uncertainty, which we're seeing in a number of areas, and it's very strong in executive compensation as well. So back in 2015, the SEC finalized rules on CEO pay ratio disclosure, which would require companies starting with their 2018 proxies to disclose the ratio of what their CEO makes versus their median employee. Companies have been spending the last year or so getting ready for that type of disclosure to be included in their proxy statements. Well, earlier this year, the SEC put those rules out for comment again. And SEC Commissioner Mike Pewar, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, was out at a conference saying, look, companies, if you haven't submitted comments yet, please let us know if you think this rule is overly burdensome, if it's very expensive for you to comply with. The SEC is really kind of indicating that they're going to be willing to make changes to those rules, possibly pull them back entirely. But in the meantime, companies have to be ready to put that disclosure in 2018 if it is required. So they're kind of living with that backdrop of what's going to happen, what is going to have to be in our proxy next year, what are we going to have to be talking to shareholders about in the question of this pay ratio. We also have some uncertainty with other SEC rules that were proposed a couple of years ago, the pay versus performance disclosure, enhanced clawback requirements. Both of those rules hang out in proposed form. They've never been finalized, unlikely to be finalized in this current administration. But again, it's the story of shareholder empowerment. Shareholders care about those issues. Even if the SEC is not pursuing that agenda, shareholders are going to companies and saying, look, it matters to me that you have strong clawbacks in place. It matters to me that I understand exactly how you're tying executive pay to company performance. So companies are doing a lot of work in that area, even absent the rules. They're putting stronger clawbacks in place. They're including a lot of disclosure in their proxy statements about how executive compensation is tied really closely to company performance.
Well, what's interesting to me too on the say on pay is we're seeing some shareholders that may not be unhappy with the pay, but are unhappy with other things, and because that's the only tool that they have to express their displeasure, will vote against a say on pay. And the other thing is your comment about shareholder engagement. It's putting great pressure on the skill set of heads of chairs of comp committees, because they're the ones that investors want to talk to about compensation. They don't want the HR person, they don't want the CEO talking about their own comp. So all those are changes in board composition that we all need to be sensitive to. So Paul, where can people get additional information both on the compensation and on the proxy voting and you guys traditionally do the proxy pulse, I believe.
Yeah, so on proxy voting, we do a series with Broadridge. Within the next few weeks, we'll be publishing our post-proxy season report. So it'll be a full report and all the data, breaking it down by institutional and retail voting, and looking at all the different types of shareholder proposals. So that's on the proxy side. On the executive compensation side, we've collaborated with Cleary Gottlieb on a series on executive compensation, specifically for board members. So it focuses on tax issues, accounting issues, setting up the structure of compensation plans, shareholder issues. So if there's interest there, just go to PwC.com to our Governance Insights Center, and you'll be able to download all of our reports on executive compensation.
Sounds great. Leah and Paul, thanks for taking the time to join us. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.